"Dad, they're going to poison everyone and nobody cares because it's just our neighborhood." 14-year-old Zoe Caldwell burst through the apartment door with the fierce energy that had characterized her personality since she could talk, clutching a manila folder against her school backpack like it contained state secrets. Darius Caldwell looked up from the kitchen table, where he was reviewing the night shift schedule for Hartwell Manufacturing, his weary eyes taking in his daughter's flushed face and the unmistakable signs that she'd discovered something that would complicate their carefully constructed, quiet life. At 43, Darius had learned to recognize when Zoe's brilliant mind had latched onto something that would challenge his primary goal of keeping them both safe and stable. Her intelligence was a gift and a burden. The same analytical thinking that made her exceptional at chemistry also drove her to ask questions that adults preferred to avoid. "Slow down, Zoe," Darius said, setting aside his work papers. "What happened at school today?" Zoe dumped her backpack on the floor and spread the contents of her folder across the kitchen table with the focused intensity she brought to every project that captured her interest. Water samples in small bottles, handwritten chemical analysis notes, printed articles about environmental contamination, and photographs of industrial runoff pipes formed a makeshift laboratory on their second-hand table. "Mrs. Chen assigned us to test water quality around the neighborhood for AP chemistry," Zoe began, her words tumbling over each other in excitement and outrage. "I thought it would be boring, just checking pH levels and dissolved oxygen. But Dad, look at these results." Darius studied the neat columns of numbers in his daughter's handwriting, his own chemistry background, allowing him to understand immediately what Zoe had discovered. The levels of heavy metals, industrial solvents, and chemical compounds were far beyond what should exist in municipal water supply. "These readings are from different locations?" Darius asked, though he already knew the answer from the methodical way Zoe had organized her data. "I tested 15 sites around our neighborhood, plus 5 control samples from the wealthy district across town," Zoe replied, pointing to her color-coded map. "The contamination gets worse the closer you get to Hartwell Manufacturing. And Dad, some of these chemicals, they cause cancer, birth defects, neurological damage." Darius felt the familiar twist in his stomach that came whenever his two worlds, the careful anonymity of janitorial work and his suppressed expertise as a former industrial chemist, threatened to collide. For 7 years, he'd successfully maintained the fiction that he was just another night custodian, that his job cleaning the offices of Hartwell Manufacturing was simply honest work that paid enough to support his daughter. But looking at Zoe's data, seeing the methodical way she'd documented what appeared to be systematic environmental contamination, Darius couldn't pretend that his background was irrelevant. "Zoe, water testing is complicated," Darius said carefully. "Your equipment might not be calibrated properly, or there could be other explanations for these readings." "Dad." Zoe's voice carried the patient tone she used when she thought adults were underestimating her intelligence. "I know you used to be a chemist before Mom died. I know you worked for environmental consulting firms. I know you understand exactly what these numbers mean." The direct confrontation made Darius pause. Zoe rarely mentioned the years before her mother's death, when Darius had worked as a senior environmental chemist, specializing in industrial contamination. She'd been 7 when cancer took her mother, 8 when Darius's whistleblowing about illegal dumping had cost him his career and blacklisted him from the environmental consulting industry. "Even if your readings are accurate," Darius said slowly, "what do you think we should do about it?" "We report it," Zoe replied immediately. "To the EPA, to the city council, to the newspapers. People are drinking this water, Dad. Kids at my school, families in our building, Mrs. Rodriguez downstairs who's been sick for months." Darius looked at his daughter, this fierce, brilliant girl who'd inherited his analytical mind, but not his hard-earned caution about the costs of challenging powerful institutions. At 14, Zoe still believed that truth was sufficient protection against retaliation, that being right would shield them from the consequences of being inconvenient. "Zoe, it's more complicated than that." "Why?" Zoe's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd grown up watching adults compromise their principles for reasons that never seemed adequate. "If a company is poisoning people, shouldn't someone stop them?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying 7 years of unspoken history about why Darius had chosen safety over principle, stability over justice, anonymous employment over the professional recognition he'd once earned. Because, Darius said finally, the last time I tried to stop a company from poisoning people, I lost my job, my reputation, and my ability to provide for you. Because sometimes being right isn't enough to protect the people you love from the consequences of challenging people with more power than conscience. Zoe was quiet for a moment, processing this rare glimpse into her father's past decisions. Is that why you work as a janitor at Hartwell? Because you can't get hired as a chemist anymore? Yes. And if we report this contamination, you'll lose your job again. Probably. Zoe studied her water analysis data, her young face showing the weight of understanding that her discovery could destroy their family's financial stability. At 14, she was old enough to understand that their Queen's apartment, her school supplies, her chemistry equipment, everything depended on Darius's steady paycheck from the company she was accusing of environmental crimes. Dad, what if I'm right? What if people are getting sick because Hartwell is dumping chemicals to save money? How do we live with knowing that and not doing anything? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Darius looked at his daughter, seeing his own younger self, the idealistic chemist who'd believed that scientific truth was more powerful than corporate lawyers, that exposing contamination was more important than personal consequences. Zoe, being right doesn't pay rent. Being right doesn't keep you in school or put food on the table. Sometimes adults have to make choices between what's morally perfect and what's practically possible. That's not an answer, Dad. That's just fear disguised as wisdom. The accuracy of Zoe's observation stung because it forced Darius to confront how thoroughly he'd internalized the lesson that survival required silence, that providing for his daughter meant accepting injustice rather than challenging it. Show me everything you found, Darius said finally. All your data, your methodology, your analysis. If we're going to discuss this, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. For the next 2 hours, Zoe walked her father through her investigation with the thoroughness of a graduate student defending her thesis. She'd tested water at multiple times of day, documented weather conditions that might affect readings, researched the specific chemicals she'd detected, and cross-referenced her findings with EPA databases about known contamination sources. The work was sophisticated, methodical, and absolutely damning. Someone at Hartwell Manufacturing was deliberately releasing industrial waste into the municipal water system, probably during night shifts when oversight was minimal and detection was unlikely. Zoe, this is professional-level environmental analysis, Darius said, reviewing her calculations for the 3rd time. Your methodology is sound, your documentation is thorough, and your conclusions are supported by the data. So I'm right. Hartwell is poisoning people. Darius looked at the evidence spread across their kitchen table, evidence that proved his current employer was committing environmental crimes that affected thousands of people, including his own daughter. Evidence that, if reported, would cost him his job and probably result in legal retaliation against their family. Evidence that, if ignored, would allow the contamination to continue indefinitely. Yes, Darius admitted. You're right. Zoe's expression showed relief mixed with determination. Then we have to do something. Zoe, we don't have to do anything. You're 14 years old. This isn't your responsibility. It became my responsibility when I discovered it, Zoe replied, with the moral certainty that made her both admirable and terrifying. And Dad, it's not just about being right. Mrs. Rodriguez has been having headaches and nausea for months. 3 kids in my chemistry class have parents with cancer. The community center daycare has had 6 children with developmental delays this year. The human cost of the contamination made Darius's concerns about employment seem selfish, but he couldn't ignore the reality that losing his job would make him unable to help anyone, including his own daughter. What exactly are you proposing we do? Darius asked. First, we gather more evidence. I can expand my testing, document patterns over time, maybe get water samples from inside the Hartwell facility to prove the source. Absolutely not, Darius said immediately. You're not going anywhere near that plant, and you're definitely not conducting unauthorized testing on corporate property. Then you do it, Zoe replied simply. You work there every night. You have access to areas where contamination might be originating. You could collect samples, document what you observe, gather the evidence we need to prove what's happening. The suggestion made perfect logical sense and represented everything Darius had spent 7 years trying to avoid. Using his position at Hartwell to investigate environmental crimes would violate his employment agreement, expose him to criminal charges if caught, and almost certainly result in his termination and blacklisting from any future employment. It would also be the right thing to do. Zoe, what you're asking could destroy our lives. Dad, what we're ignoring is already destroying other people's lives. As they sat in their small kitchen, surrounded by evidence of corporate environmental crimes, Darius realized that his daughter had inherited more than his analytical abilities. She'd inherited his sense of moral responsibility, his belief that scientific knowledge created ethical obligations, his conviction that some truths were too important to keep secret. The question now was whether he'd also inherited enough courage to act on those convictions, even when the personal cost was potentially devastating. Some discoveries, Darius was learning, carried the weight of moral choice that no amount of careful living could avoid. The argument between father and daughter continued for 3 days, carried on in whispered conversations during dinner, tense exchanges while Zoe did homework, and careful discussions during Darius's brief window between coming home from his night shift and Zoe leaving for school. The manila folder of water analysis data remained spread across their kitchen table like evidence in a trial neither of them wanted to face. "Dad, you're being a coward," Zoe said bluntly on Thursday morning, her 14-year-old directness cutting through the careful rationalizations Darius had been constructing to avoid action. "I'm being realistic," Darius replied, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. "You're asking me to risk everything we've built for the past 7 years based on your science project." "It's not a science project," Zoe shot back, her voice carrying the frustrated authority of someone whose expertise was being dismissed because of her age. "It's documented evidence of environmental crimes that are making people sick." Darius looked at his daughter across their small kitchen, seeing the moral certainty in her expression that reminded him painfully of his younger self. Before Carol's death, before the whistleblowing that had destroyed his career, before 7 years of careful anonymity had taught him that survival required compromise. "Zoe, let me tell you what happened the last time I tried to be a hero," Darius said, settling into the chair across from her with the weariness of someone about to excavate buried trauma. For the next hour, Darius told his daughter the full story of his previous career as an environmental consultant, the contamination case that had ended everything, and the price his family had paid for his decision to prioritize truth over security. He'd been working for Morrison Environmental Consulting when he'd discovered that Apex Chemical was illegally dumping mercury compounds into groundwater that supplied 3 rural communities. The contamination levels were severe enough to cause neurological damage, birth defects, and cognitive impairment in children who drank the water regularly. "I did everything right," Darius explained, his voice carrying the bitter education of experience. "I documented the contamination thoroughly, followed proper reporting procedures, presented evidence to regulatory agencies. I thought that truth and scientific rigor would be sufficient protection." "What happened?" Zoe asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be justice triumphant. "Apex's lawyers destroyed my reputation systematically. They questioned my methodology, suggested I'd falsified data for personal gain, implied I was mentally unstable due to your mother's illness. Morrison Environmental fired me to protect their other contracts. Within 6 months, I couldn't get hired by any consulting firm in the environmental industry." Zoe absorbed this information with the seriousness she brought to all discussions about her father's past. "But you were right about the contamination." "Yes." 3 years later, after dozens of children had suffered preventable neurological damage, the EPA finally confirmed everything I'd reported. Apex paid a settlement that was less than they'd made in profits during the delay. The communities got clean water, but the children who'd been poisoned during those 3 years never recovered. And you couldn't work as an environmental chemist anymore. Blacklisted, difficult to work with, questionable professional judgment, history of making unfounded accusations. The industry is smaller than people realize, and word travels fast about consultants who cause problems for corporate clients. Darius watched his daughter process the implications of his story, that doing the right thing had cost him his career, his professional identity, and his ability to support his family in the way he'd planned. That being right hadn't been enough to protect them from the consequences of challenging powerful interests. "Is that why Mom had to work 2 jobs toward the end?" Zoe asked quietly. "Yes. She was a substitute teacher and cleaned offices at night because my consulting income disappeared. The stress probably contributed to—" Darius couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say aloud that his wife's overwork during his unemployment might have compromised her ability to fight the cancer that eventually killed her. Zoe was quiet for a long moment, staring at her water analysis data with new understanding of what her discoveries might cost their family. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know that your whistleblowing had hurt you so badly. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," Darius said. "I'm telling you so you understand why I'm careful about challenging corporations that have the resources to destroy people who inconvenience them. But Dad, if you hadn't reported the mercury contamination, more children would have been poisoned. Even though it cost you personally, you probably saved lives." The observation was accurate and painful. Darius had never been able to decide whether his whistleblowing had been heroic or selfish, whether he'd acted from moral courage or professional arrogance, whether the human lives he'd potentially saved justified the damage to his own family. "Maybe," Darius said. "But Zoe, I can't afford to be unemployed again. We don't have savings. We don't have family support. We don't have any safety net except my steady paycheck from Hartwell Manufacturing. What if we could find a way to report the contamination without exposing you as the source?" Zoe asked. "Anonymous tips, leaked documents, ways to get the information to environmental groups without connecting it back to our family?" Darius appreciated his daughter's strategic thinking, but 7 years of careful survival had taught him that anonymity was rarely protection against determined corporate retaliation. "Zoe, if Hartwell's contamination becomes public, they'll investigate every possible source of the leak. They'll review security footage, analyze who had access to what information, interview employees about suspicious behavior. Even if we tried to stay anonymous, they'd probably figure out that someone with environmental chemistry expertise was involved. So you're saying we should just ignore what I discovered? Let people keep drinking poisoned water because reporting it might cost you your job?" The brutal simplicity of Zoe's question forced Darius to confront the moral calculation he'd been avoiding. Protecting his employment meant allowing environmental contamination to continue. Protecting his community meant risking his family's financial security. "I'm saying that sometimes adults have to choose between competing responsibilities," Darius replied. "My first responsibility is to you, to making sure you have housing and food and educational opportunities. If I lose my job, I can't fulfill those responsibilities. And my responsibility is to tell the truth about what I discovered," Zoe said. "I can't unknow what I know, Dad. I can't pretend that other families don't matter just because protecting them might be inconvenient for us." The generational difference in their perspectives was stark. Darius shaped by experience with the costs of principle, Zoe driven by belief that moral clarity justified personal risk. Neither position was wrong, but they led to incompatible conclusions about action. "Zoe, what if I promise to look into this more carefully, to use my access at Hartwell to gather additional evidence before we decide how to proceed?" "What kind of additional evidence?" Darius considered what he could realistically accomplish during his night shifts without triggering suspicion. "I could identify potential sources of contamination within the facility, document when and how waste disposal occurs, maybe collect samples from outflow pipes or storage areas. Would that be enough to prove what's happening?" "It would provide more definitive evidence about the source and scope of contamination. Right now, your data proves that contamination exists, but we can't definitively prove that Hartwell is the source without access to their internal operations." Zoe's expression showed the calculation of someone weighing moral urgency against strategic patience. "How long would this investigation take?" "A few weeks, maybe a month. I'd need to be careful, systematic, avoid drawing attention to unusual behavior. And during that time, people continue drinking contaminated water." "Yes," Darius admitted. "But if we act too quickly without sufficient evidence, We might not be able to stop the contamination permanently. Corporate lawyers are very good at creating doubt about environmental claims that aren't absolutely bulletproof. Zoe stared at her water analysis data for a long moment, her young face showing the weight of responsibility that shouldn't fall on 14-year-old shoulders. Dad, can I ask you something honestly? Always. Are you suggesting we gather more evidence because it's strategically smart, or because you're hoping I'll lose interest if we delay long enough? The directness of the question forced Darius to examine his own motivations. Part of him was indeed hoping that additional time might lead Zoe to focus her attention on safer projects, that teenage priorities might shift away from environmental activism toward more typical adolescent concerns. Both, Darius admitted. I think more evidence would strengthen any eventual case we might make, but I'm also hoping that you'll understand the risks well enough to decide that this isn't worth destroying our family's stability. Dad, I love you, and I understand that you're trying to protect me, but I can't pretend I didn't discover this contamination, and I can't accept that other families matter less than our family. Zoe gathered her water analysis materials and organized them back into the manila folder with the careful precision she brought to all important tasks. I'm going to give you 1 month to gather additional evidence from inside Hartwell. But Dad, if you don't find a way to stop the contamination by then, I'm going to report what I know to environmental groups, whether you support me or not. The ultimatum was delivered with calm determination rather than adolescent defiance, which made it more threatening rather than less. Darius recognized that his daughter had inherited not just his analytical abilities, but also his fundamental inability to ignore injustice when confronted with clear evidence. Zoe, if you act independently, you could put both of us in serious danger. And if we don't act at all, we're definitely putting other people in serious danger, Zoe replied. Dad, I need you to be my partner in this, not my obstacle. But either way, I'm not going to stay silent about environmental crimes just because revealing them might be inconvenient. As Zoe left for school with her backpack and her unwavering moral certainty, Darius sat alone in their kitchen, surrounded by the water analysis data that would force him to choose between the safety he'd spent 7 years building and the principles he'd spent 7 years suppressing. Some discoveries, he was learning, couldn't be ignored without becoming complicit in the harm they revealed. The question now was whether he had enough courage left to risk everything they'd built for the possibility of protecting people he'd never met from harm they might never directly trace to its source. 3 weeks into his clandestine investigation, Darius had gathered enough evidence to confirm his daughter's worst fears and his own deepest concerns. Every night shift at Hartwell Manufacturing revealed new layers of systematic environmental contamination, illegal discharge pipes hidden behind false walls, chemical waste mixed with municipal sewage during off hours, and disposal protocols that violated every environmental regulation he'd ever studied. The evidence was hidden in his apartment now, stored in a fireproof box that had once contained important family documents. Water samples from internal outflow pipes, photographs of concealed waste systems, documentation of chemical storage procedures that would horrify EPA inspectors. Everything Zoe needed to prove that Hartwell Manufacturing was deliberately poisoning their community to save disposal costs. Dad, you look terrible, Zoe observed over breakfast, studying his face with the analytical attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. Are you sleeping at all? Darius rubbed his eyes, trying to ease the strain of weeks spent documenting crimes during work hours while maintaining his normal janitorial duties. I'm fine, Zoe, just busy with some projects. What kind of projects? Zoe's tone carried the patient skepticism she used when she suspected adults were withholding important information. Darius looked at his daughter, this brilliant, determined girl who'd forced him to confront his own moral cowardice, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. The kind of projects that prove you were right about everything, Darius said, pulling out the fireproof box and setting it on their kitchen table. For the next hour, Darius walked Zoe through 3 weeks of evidence that documented the most comprehensive environmental contamination case he'd encountered in his career. Hartwell Manufacturing wasn't just cutting corners on waste disposal. They were operating an entire shadow system designed to avoid environmental regulations while maintaining plausible deniability. Dad, this is incredible, Zoe breathed, reviewing photographs of concealed discharge pipes and chemical analysis results that showed contamination levels far beyond what her original testing had detected. This proves everything. We can shut them down completely. We can try, Darius corrected. But Zoe, gathering this evidence has probably already cost me my job. Security cameras recorded me in areas where janitors don't belong, my keycard access shows unusual patterns, and I've been asking questions that maintenance staff wouldn't normally ask. Zoe looked up from the documents, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. Do you think they know what you've been doing? I think they suspect something. Yesterday, my supervisor asked why I'd been working so slowly, and this morning I found my locker had been searched. Nothing was missing, but someone had been through my things. The implications settled over them like a storm cloud. If Hartwell suspected Darius of investigating their operations, his employment was already effectively over. The only question was whether they'd fire him quietly or pursue legal action for industrial espionage. Dad, I'm sorry, Zoe said quietly. I didn't mean for you to lose your job because of what I discovered. Zoe, you didn't make me investigate this. I chose to do it because you were right. Some things are more important than job security. Darius managed a tired smile. Besides, I was always going to lose this job eventually. Hartwell can't afford to keep employees who know too much about their illegal operations. So what do we do now? Before Darius could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Rachel Hartwell's direct line. The CEO calling a night janitor at 8 in the morning was unprecedented and ominous. Mr. Caldwell, Rachel's voice was professionally controlled, but carried an undertone of tension. I need to see you in my office immediately. There are some concerns about your recent work performance that require discussion. Miss Hartwell, my shift ended 2 hours ago. Could we schedule this meeting for... This isn't a request, Mr. Caldwell. Security will escort you to my office within the hour, or your employment will be terminated for insubordination. After hanging up, Darius looked at Zoe, both of them understanding that the careful investigation phase had just ended abruptly. They know, Zoe said simply. They know something. The question is how much and what they plan to do about it. Darius gathered the evidence from their kitchen table, organizing everything into a folder that could be quickly transferred to environmental authorities if necessary. Zoe, if this goes badly, I need you to take this evidence to the Sierra Club office downtown. Ask for Maria Santos. She's an environmental attorney who handles industrial contamination cases. Dad, you're scaring me. I'm being realistic. Corporations don't call emergency meetings with employees they suspect of espionage unless they're planning serious retaliation. An hour later, Darius sat in Rachel Hartwell's executive office, facing the third-generation CEO, whose family had built their fortune on manufacturing processes that apparently included systematic environmental crimes. At 39, Rachel carried herself with the confident authority of someone who'd inherited both wealth and the assumption that rules were suggestions rather than requirements. Mr. Caldwell, Rachel began, settling behind her mahogany desk with documents that Darius recognized as security reports. We've noticed some unusual patterns in your work behavior over the past month. What kind of patterns? Darius asked, though he already knew what the surveillance had revealed. Access to areas outside your normal cleaning route, extended time in locations that shouldn't require extensive maintenance, questions to other employees about operational procedures that don't relate to janitorial duties. Rachel slid a photograph across the desk, security camera footage showing Darius near the concealed outflow pipes with what was obviously a water sample container. Additionally, we've discovered that you have a background in environmental chemistry, despite listing only general maintenance experience on your employment application. The revelation that they'd investigated his professional history meant Hartwell's legal team was preparing for serious confrontation. Companies didn't conduct background investigations on janitors unless they suspected industrial espionage or whistleblowing. Miss Hartwell, I can explain, Mr. Caldwell, let me save us both time, Rachel interrupted. We know you've been conducting unauthorized testing of our facilities. We know you have the expertise to understand what you've observed. And we know that your daughter has been asking questions about water quality in your neighborhood. The mention of Zoe sent cold fear through Darius's chest. If Hartwell was monitoring his family, they'd moved beyond employment issues into potential intimidation and retaliation. My daughter's school projects have nothing to do with my work here. Your daughter's school project detected contamination patterns that suggest sophisticated analysis of our operational impact, Rachel said, producing copies of Zoe's original water testing results. 14-year-olds don't typically conduct environmental assessments that could form the basis for EPA investigations. Darius realized that Hartwell had been monitoring their family far more extensively than he'd suspected. They'd probably reviewed Zoe's school records, interviewed her teachers, maybe even observed their apartment building. "What do you want, Miss Hartwell?" Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying Darius with the calculating expression of someone evaluating options. "I want to offer you a choice, Mr. Caldwell, a choice that could benefit both our interests." "What kind of choice?" "You're obviously overqualified for janitorial work. Your background in environmental chemistry suggests capabilities that could be valuable to our operations." Rachel paused, letting the implication settle. "We're prepared to offer you a position as Environmental Compliance Manager, with a salary of $80,000 annually, full benefits and relocation assistance to a city where your expertise would be better appreciated." The offer was generous, professional, and absolutely corrupt. They were trying to buy his silence with the kind of position he'd been unable to obtain for 7 years, along with geographic distance that would remove him from the community he'd discovered they were poisoning. "And if I decline this generous offer, then we'll be forced to pursue legal action for industrial espionage, theft of proprietary information, and violation of your employment agreement. We'll also be required to report suspected environmental activism to local authorities as potential eco-terrorism." The threats were carefully crafted to destroy both his employability and his freedom. Industrial espionage charges would make him unemployable anywhere, while eco-terrorism allegations would bring federal investigation and surveillance. "So, Missy Hartwell, what about the contamination? What about the people who are being poisoned by your operations?" Rachel's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Caldwell, you're an employee who's been terminated for cause. Any claims you might make about our operations would be seen as the desperate accusations of a disgruntled worker seeking revenge. Even with documented evidence obtained through criminal trespass and industrial espionage isn't admissible in environmental proceedings. You'd be discredited before any hearing began." Darius understood the trap completely. They'd allowed him to gather evidence while creating legal justification to dismiss anything he might reveal. His investigation had provided them with documentation of his crimes rather than theirs. "How long do I have to consider your offer?" 24 hours. After that, we'll assume you've chosen the difficult path and proceed accordingly." As Darius left Rachel's office, escorted by security through the building he'd cleaned for 7 years, he realized that his choice wasn't really between accepting corruption or facing retaliation. His choice was between protecting his family through complicity or protecting his community through sacrifice. That evening, he sat with Zoe in their kitchen, explaining that everything they'd built together was about to change, regardless of which choice he made. "Dad," Zoe said, after absorbing the implications of his meeting with Rachel, "if you take their job offer, the contamination continues forever. And if I don't take it, we'll probably lose our apartment, and I'll face criminal charges that could send me to prison." Zoe was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence they'd gathered, proof of environmental crimes that could save their community but destroy their family. "Dad, what would Mom want you to do?" The question hit harder than anything Rachel Hartwell had threatened. Carol had died believing that her husband's principles mattered more than personal convenience, that their daughter should grow up seeing her father choose courage over comfort. "Your mom would want me to do the right thing," Darius said quietly, "even if it cost us everything." "Then that's what we do," Zoe replied simply. "We do the right thing, and we figure out how to survive the consequences together." Some choices, Darius realized, were tests of character rather than calculations of benefit. Tomorrow, he would discover whether 7 years of careful survival had preserved or destroyed the man his wife had married and his daughter deserved to call father. The call came at 6:23 a.m., 18 hours before Darius's deadline to accept Rachel Hartwell's offer. Zoe answered the phone, Because Darius was in the shower, preparing for what might be his last day of freedom before becoming either a corporate accomplice or a federal defendant. "Mr. Caldwell." The voice was professionally crisp, but carried an urgency that made Zoe immediately alert. "This is Dr. Patricia Morrison from the Environmental Protection Agency. I need to speak with you immediately about some water quality data that's been brought to our attention." Zoe's eyes widened as she recognized the implications. Someone had already reported their findings to federal authorities, but she and her father hadn't contacted the EPA, which meant either their investigation had been discovered by environmental groups or Hartwell Manufacturing was trying to control the narrative by reporting them first. "He's not available right now," Zoe said carefully. "Can I take a message?" "This concerns environmental contamination allegations involving Hartwell Manufacturing. We understand that Mr. Caldwell may have relevant information about potential violations." When Darius emerged from the bathroom, Zoe handed him the phone with an expression that mixed excitement with concern. The conversation that followed lasted 47 minutes and changed everything they'd planned about handling their evidence. "Dr. Morrison," Darius said after the call ended, "just told me that Rachel Hartwell contacted the EPA yesterday afternoon to report suspected environmental activism by a former employee. She's trying to frame our investigation as eco-terrorism before we can present evidence of actual contamination." Zoe felt anger building in her chest, not the teenage frustration she felt about homework or social problems, but the cold fury that came from watching powerful people manipulate systems that were supposed to protect vulnerable communities. "So they're accusing us of the crimes they're actually committing. Worse than that, they're using Rachel's cooperation with federal authorities to establish credibility while portraying us as unreliable activists with personal vendettas." Darius sat heavily at their kitchen table, looking older than his 43 years. "Dr. Morrison wants to interview us this afternoon, but she made it clear that we're being investigated as potential perpetrators rather than witnesses." "What did you tell her?" "That we have documented evidence of systematic environmental contamination and that we're willing to cooperate fully with any investigation." Zoe studied her father's expression, recognizing the calculation of someone weighing impossible options. "Dad, do you think we can trust the EPA?" "I think the EPA will follow the evidence, but they'll also follow political pressure. Rachel Hartwell has resources and connections that we don't have. If this becomes a credibility contest between a respected CEO and an unemployed janitor, we'll lose regardless of how strong our evidence is." Before Zoe could respond, their apartment building's buzzer rang. Through the intercom, a woman's voice identified herself as Dr. Sandra Chen from the Community Environmental Justice Center, asking to speak with the Caldwell family about water quality concerns in their neighborhood. "That's not the EPA," Zoe observed. "No," Darius agreed, "but word is getting out about our investigation faster than we expected." "Doctor." Chen arrived 10 minutes later, a 40-something Asian-American woman in practical clothes, who carried herself with the focused energy of someone accustomed to fighting environmental battles against well-funded opponents. She was accompanied by Maria Santos, the environmental attorney Darius had mentioned to Zoe as a potential contact. "Mr. Caldwell, Miss Caldwell, Doctor." Chen began, settling into their small living room with documents that suggested she'd already researched their situation extensively. "We understand that you've discovered evidence of industrial contamination in your neighborhood." "How did you know about our investigation?" Darius asked. Maria Santos answered, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who'd spent years representing communities against corporate polluters. "Yesterday afternoon, Rachel Hartwell's attorneys contacted several environmental organizations to warn us about potential fraudulent contamination claims by a disgruntled former employee. The specificity of their warnings suggested they were trying to preempt something significant." "So you came to hear our side before accepting their version?" Zoe asked. "We came because preemptive legal warnings from corporate attorneys usually indicate that someone has discovered something they desperately want to keep hidden," Dr. Chen replied. "Can you show us what you found?" For the next 3 hours, Darius and Zoe presented their evidence to the two environmental advocates, walking through water analysis data, internal documentation, and photographic proof of concealed contamination systems. "Doctor." Chen and Maria asked detailed questions about methodology, timing, and potential legal challenges to their findings. "This is extraordinary work," Dr. Chen said finally, reviewing Zoe's original water analysis data. "The scope of contamination you've documented would affect thousands of people, and the evidence is thorough enough to support federal intervention." "But," Darius prompted, recognizing the tone of someone about to explain complications. "But Hartwell Manufacturing has anticipated your revelations and created legal obstacles that will make prosecution difficult," Maria explained. "They've already characterized you as an industrial spy, suggested that your evidence was obtained through criminal means, and established themselves as cooperative parties, reporting suspected environmental activism." Zoe felt her stomach clench with understanding. "So even though we're right about the contamination, they can make it look like we're the criminals." "They can try," Maria corrected, "but they've made a strategic mistake by involving federal authorities. Once the EPA begins investigating, they'll have to examine all evidence regardless of the source. Environmental crimes don't become legal just because they're reported by unreliable witnesses." Dr. Chen leaned forward, with the intensity of someone who'd seen communities destroyed by exactly this kind of corporate contamination. "Mr. Caldwell, Miss Caldwell, we'd like to propose a partnership. Our organizations have resources that individual families don't have: legal representation, scientific expertise, media connections, and experience fighting environmental battles against well-funded opponents." "What kind of partnership?" Darius asked. "We provide legal protection for your family while pursuing federal prosecution of Hartwell Manufacturing. We have attorneys who specialize in whistleblower protection, scientists who can validate and expand your evidence, and media contacts who understand how to present environmental stories in ways that create public pressure for enforcement." Maria added, "We also have experience with corporate retaliation tactics. Hartwell will try to destroy your reputation, eliminate your employment opportunities, and isolate you from community support. We can provide resources to help you survive that campaign while fighting for justice." Zoe looked at her father, seeing him weigh the offer of professional support against years of hard-earned caution about trusting institutions that claim to help vulnerable people. "What would this partnership require from us?" Darius asked. "Complete transparency about your evidence and methods, cooperation with expanded scientific testing to confirm and document contamination, willingness to testify in legal proceedings and speak with media about your discoveries. And in return, legal representation, financial support during the investigation period, and coordination with federal authorities to ensure your evidence receives proper consideration," Dr. Chen replied. "Plus protection from retaliation and assistance with employment if Hartwell succeeds in blacklisting you from your industry." The offer was everything Darius had hoped for, but never expected. Professional support that could protect his family while ensuring their evidence reached authorities capable of stopping the contamination. "There's one more thing," Maria said, pulling out her phone to show them a news article. "This morning, 3 families in your neighborhood filed emergency medical claims related to contamination-related illness. Children with developmental delays, adults with neurological symptoms, elderly residents with respiratory problems. The human cost of this contamination is becoming visible." Zoe felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders again. Her chemistry project had revealed environmental crimes, but real people were suffering real harm while they debated strategy and worried about personal consequences. "Dad," Zoe said quietly, "we can't wait any longer. People are getting sick right now." Darius looked at his daughter, this brilliant, determined girl who'd forced him to remember that some responsibilities transcended personal safety, and then at the 2 environmental advocates who were offering resources to fight battles his family couldn't win alone. "What's the first step?" Darius asked. Dr. Chen smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd convinced another family to stand up against corporate environmental crimes. "First, we contact the EPA together and present your evidence as part of a coordinated environmental justice investigation. Your documentation becomes evidence in a federal case rather than the desperate claims of a disgruntled employee. Then we expand the scientific analysis," Maria continued. "Our lab can validate and enhance your findings, document the full scope of contamination, and establish clear connections between Hartwell's operations and community health impacts. And finally, we prepare for war, Dr. Chen said bluntly, because Hartwell Manufacturing will use every resource at their disposal to discredit this investigation and destroy anyone who threatens their operations. This isn't just about environmental protection. It's about whether corporations can poison communities with impunity. As they planned the next phase of their campaign, Zoe realized that her science project had evolved into something far larger than she'd anticipated. What had started as individual family trying to protect their community had become part of a broader movement, challenging corporate environmental crimes. "Dr. Chen," Zoe said, "what happens if we win? If we prove that Hartwell has been poisoning people and force them to stop? Then your community gets clean water, your neighbors get medical compensation, and other corporations learn that environmental crimes have consequences," Dr. Chen replied. "Plus, you'll have demonstrated that ordinary families can challenge powerful institutions when they have courage and scientific evidence." "And if we lose?" Dr. Chen and Maria exchanged glances, acknowledging the reality that environmental justice battles often cost more than they delivered. "If we lose," Maria said honestly, "Hartwell continues poisoning your community. Your family faces ongoing retaliation, and other corporations learn that they can silence environmental whistleblowers through intimidation." The stakes were clear, the risks were substantial, and the outcome was uncertain. But as Darius looked at the evidence spread across their kitchen table, proof of environmental crimes that threatened thousands of people, he realized that some battles had to be fought, regardless of the odds. "When do we start?" Darius asked. "We already have," Dr. Chen replied, pulling out her phone to call the EPA. "Welcome to environmental warfare, Caldwell family. Let's go save your community." Some alliances, Darius was learning, were forged not through shared interests but through shared determination to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The question now was whether their coalition would be strong enough to survive the corporate counterattack that was already being planned in executive boardrooms and legal conference rooms across Manhattan. The EPA investigation escalated with bureaucratic speed that surprised everyone except the corporate attorneys who'd been preparing for exactly this scenario. Within 72 hours of Dr. Chen's coordinated evidence presentation, federal agents were conducting surprise inspections at Hartwell Manufacturing, while Rachel Hartwell's legal team launched a comprehensive assault on the credibility of every witness, scientist, and advocate involved in the case. The confrontation came to a head during the emergency public hearing called by the State Environmental Agency, where Zoe found herself sitting at a witness table facing a room packed with Hartwell employees, community members, federal agents, and reporters whose cameras would broadcast her testimony across the region. At 14, Zoe had never imagined that her chemistry project would culminate in federal testimony, but as she looked out at faces that included her neighbors, her father, and Rachel Hartwell herself, she understood that this moment would determine whether corporate environmental crimes had consequences or whether powerful institutions could silence inconvenient truth through intimidation. "Miss Caldwell," the hearing officer began, "you've alleged that Hartwell Manufacturing has been deliberately contaminating municipal water supplies. These are serious accusations that could result in criminal charges and significant economic impact. Please explain how a 14-year-old student came to these conclusions." Zoe had practiced this moment with Maria Santos, but sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, with dozens of cameras focused on her face, she felt the weight of responsibility that no teenager should carry. Her answer would either validate months of investigation or provide Hartwell's attorneys with ammunition to discredit everything her family had discovered. "I tested water quality around my neighborhood for a school chemistry project," Zoe began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The contamination levels were so high that I thought my equipment was malfunctioning, but when I retested multiple sites over several weeks, the pattern was consistent. Toxic chemicals that increased in concentration as you approached Hartwell Manufacturing. And what qualified you to conduct this analysis?" "My father is a trained environmental chemist who taught me proper testing methodology. I used EPA-approved protocols and cross-referenced my findings with federal contamination databases." Rachel Hartwell's attorney, a silver-haired man whose expensive suit announced his determination to protect corporate interests, stood to object. Your Honor, this witness is a minor whose alleged analysis was conducted without proper certification, chain of custody protocols, or oversight by qualified professionals. The witness has a right to present her findings, the hearing officer replied. Mr. Davidson, you'll have opportunity for cross-examination. For the next hour, Zoe walked through her water analysis data, explaining her methodology with the precision her father had taught her and the moral clarity that made her testimony more compelling than any professional expert's report. She wasn't just presenting scientific data, she was describing her community's exposure to preventable harm. Miss Caldwell, Davidson began his cross-examination with the condescending tone attorneys used when they wanted to diminish witnesses. Isn't it true that your father was terminated from his previous environmental consulting position for making false accusations against a chemical company? Maria Santos objected immediately, but the damage was intentional, establishing doubt about the Caldwell family's credibility while suggesting a pattern of unfounded environmental claims. My father was blacklisted from environmental consulting because he reported mercury contamination that was later confirmed by federal investigators, Zoe replied, her voice carrying the edge that came from watching people twist truth into weapon. 3 years after he reported the contamination, the EPA validated everything he'd found, and the company paid settlements to affected families. But he was initially discredited by his professional peers. He was discredited by corporations that didn't want to pay for proper waste disposal, Zoe shot back. Being right doesn't protect you from retaliation when you expose environmental crimes. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with testimony from federal environmental scientists who confirmed the contamination, Hartwell employees who denied knowledge of illegal disposal, and community members who described health problems that aligned with toxic exposure patterns. But the moment that changed everything came when Dr. Patricia Morrison from the EPA presented results from their surprise facility inspection. During our investigation of Hartwell manufacturing, Dr. Morrison testified, we discovered a sophisticated system of concealed disposal pipes designed to discharge untreated chemical waste into municipal water systems during night shifts when monitoring was minimal. She displayed photographs on the courtroom screens. The same concealed pipes Darius had documented, now photographed by federal agents with proper chain of custody protocols. Additionally, we found internal documents indicating that Hartwell management was aware of contamination risks, but chose to continue illegal disposal to avoid costs associated with proper waste treatment. The evidence was devastating, but Rachel Hartwell's response was swift and strategic. Within hours of Dr. Morrison's testimony, Hartwell Manufacturing announced they were immediately implementing enhanced environmental protocols, hiring independent monitoring services, and establishing a community health fund to address any concerns related to their operations. We take environmental responsibility seriously, Rachel told reporters outside the hearing, her corporate communication training evident in every carefully chosen word. While we dispute the characterization of our previous operations, we're committed to exceeding all environmental standards and supporting our community's well-being. The announcement was calculated to minimize criminal liability while positioning Hartwell as a responsible corporation, addressing isolated problems rather than systematic environmental crimes. But the community's response was immediate and furious. That evening, over 300 residents gathered in the high school auditorium for what organizers called a community truth session. Families shared stories of unexplained illnesses, children's developmental delays, and medical bills they couldn't afford for conditions that might have been prevented if Hartwell had followed basic environmental regulations. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman from Darius's building, stood slowly with the aid of a walker and addressed the packed auditorium. My doctors said my neurological symptoms might be related to toxic exposure, but I never knew where it was coming from. Now I understand that I've been paying for this company's illegal dumping with my health. The human cost of Hartwell's environmental crimes became undeniable as family after family described how contamination had affected their lives. Parents talked about children who struggled in school due to cognitive impacts. Adults described chronic illnesses that had no clear medical explanation until the contamination was revealed. "This isn't just about water quality," said Tom Chen, whose 8-year-old daughter had been diagnosed with developmental delays 6 months earlier. "This is about whether corporations can poison our children to increase their profits." As the community meeting continued past midnight, Darius sat beside Zoe in the auditorium, watching their neighbors transform individual suffering into collective demand for justice. His daughter's chemistry project had become a catalyst for community organizing that extended far beyond environmental protection. "Dad," Zoe whispered, as yet another family described health impacts that aligned with toxic exposure, "I never imagined that my water testing would lead to all this." "You couldn't have known," Darius replied. "But Zoe, this is what happens when someone has the courage to tell the truth about systems that depend on silence." The federal criminal investigation that followed the hearing moved with unprecedented speed, driven by media attention and community pressure that made Hartwell Manufacturing a symbol of corporate environmental crime. Within 6 months, 3 company executives were indicted on environmental violations, fraud, and conspiracy charges. Rachel Hartwell herself faced a choice that would define both her personal future and her company's survival: cooperate with federal investigators by revealing the full scope of illegal operations, or maintain corporate loyalty and face potential criminal prosecution. The decision came during a private meeting with federal prosecutors, where Rachel was offered immunity in exchange for complete disclosure about Hartwell's environmental crimes and cooperation in prosecuting the executives who had implemented illegal disposal systems. "Ms. Hartwell," the lead prosecutor explained, "our investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic environmental violations spanning 15 years. We're offering you an opportunity to distinguish between the corporation you inherited and the crimes you may have unknowingly perpetuated." Rachel looked at documents that detailed environmental damages totaling over $400 million, criminal exposure that could result in decades of prison time, and civil liability that would bankrupt her family's company. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Tell the truth about how long you've known about illegal disposal practices, provide complete documentation of environmental violations, and testify against the executives who designed and implemented these systems." The offer required Rachel to admit that her family's fortune had been built partially on environmental crimes, that her company had poisoned the community where she'd grown up, and that her management decisions had prioritized profits over public health. But refusing the offer meant facing criminal prosecution that would result in personal imprisonment and corporate destruction, without any opportunity to repair the damage Hartwell had caused. "If I cooperate, what happens to the company?" Hartwell Manufacturing would face substantial fines and ongoing federal monitoring, but could potentially survive under new management committed to environmental compliance. Rachel realized that her choice wasn't between protecting her company and destroying it. Her choice was between accepting responsibility for environmental crimes and being destroyed by them without any opportunity for redemption. 3 months later, Rachel Hartwell stood before the same federal hearing officer who had overseen Zoe's testimony, but this time she was confessing rather than denying her company's environmental crimes. "I've learned that my family's company has been systematically violating environmental regulations for over a decade," Rachel testified, her voice carrying none of the corporate confidence she'd displayed during earlier proceedings. "I take full responsibility for failing to ensure that our operations protected community health, and I'm committed to making complete restitution for the harm we've caused." The admission was devastating to her family's reputation and fortune, but it also cleared the way for environmental cleanup that would take years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. As Zoe watched Rachel's testimony from the courtroom gallery, sitting beside her father and the environmental advocates who had become their allies, she felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. They had won. The contamination would be stopped, the community would receive medical support and financial compensation, and corporate executives would face criminal consequences for environmental crimes. But victory had cost more than anyone had anticipated. Hartwell Manufacturing's closure had eliminated 800 jobs in a community that depended on the company for economic stability. Families who had supported environmental cleanup were now struggling with unemployment that might last for years Some community members blamed the Caldwell family for destroying local employment, arguing that environmental problems could have been addressed without shutting down the region's largest employer. "Dad," Zoe said as they left the courthouse after Rachel's testimony, "I thought winning would feel better than this." "Justice isn't the same as happiness," Darius replied, looking at the protesters outside who were demanding both environmental cleanup and economic recovery. "We did the right thing, but right things sometimes have complicated consequences." As they walked toward the subway that would take them back to Queens, Darius understood that environmental victories were often bittersweet, protecting community health while destroying community prosperity, stopping corporate crimes while eliminating corporate employment. Some battles, he was learning, had to be won regardless of their cost to the people fighting them. 2 years after Rachel Hartwell's testimony brought down her family's manufacturing empire, Darius Caldwell stood in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, watching his 16-year-old daughter train a group of high school students to conduct water quality testing as part of a community environmental monitoring program. The transformation of their lives had been as dramatic as it was unexpected. Darius now worked as environmental justice coordinator for the Community Environmental Health Coalition, earning less money than he'd made as a janitor, but finding purpose in work that aligned with his values and expertise. Zoe had become something of a celebrity in environmental justice circles, the teenager whose chemistry project had exposed corporate environmental crimes and sparked a national conversation about community-based scientific monitoring. But the personal costs of their victory were evident in ways that news articles never captured. "Zoe, you're pushing them too hard," Darius observed, as his daughter corrected a student's testing technique with the impatience of someone who'd forgotten that not everyone shared her obsessive attention to scientific precision. At 16, Zoe had grown 3 inches and developed the focused intensity of someone who'd learned too young that individual actions could affect thousands of people. She was brilliant, dedicated, and carrying emotional weight that no teenager should bear. "Dad, if they don't understand proper methodology, their data won't be useful for legal proceedings," Zoe replied, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she'd developed since becoming a public figure in environmental advocacy. "Zoe, they're high school students learning community science, not graduate researchers preparing for federal testimony." The gentle correction made Zoe pause, and Darius could see her recognize that she was applying professional standards to educational workshops. Over the past 2 years, Zoe had struggled to maintain normal teenage experiences while serving as a symbol of youth environmental activism. "You're right," Zoe admitted, her expression softening as she turned back to the students with more patience. "Sorry, everyone. Let's focus on understanding the concepts first, and we'll worry about precision later." As the workshop continued, Darius reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that morning when Zoe had burst through their apartment door with water samples and moral certainty. The girl who'd discovered Hartwell's contamination was now nationally recognized as an expert in community environmental monitoring, invited to speak at conferences, and consulted by environmental organizations developing youth engagement programs. But she was also a 16-year-old who'd lost much of her adolescence to adult responsibilities, who sometimes woke up from nightmares about community members whose health had been damaged while she debated whether to report her findings. "Mr. Caldwell?" One of the students approached with a question about interpreting chemical analysis results. "My readings show elevated levels of something called benzene. Is that dangerous?" Darius helped the student understand the health implications of benzene exposure, while mentally noting that they'd need to investigate potential contamination sources in the student's neighborhood. This was how environmental justice work operated. Each answered question revealed new problems that required community response. After the workshop ended and students left with their testing kits and data sheets, Darius and Zoe cleaned up the equipment in comfortable silence that reflected 2 years of working together as environmental advocacy partners. "Dad," Zoe said as she organized water sample containers, "Rachel called yesterday. She wants to meet with us next week." Darius looked up sharply. Rachel Hartwell had largely disappeared from public view after her company's collapse, reportedly living in a small apartment in Queens and working for a non-profit environmental organization. Her transformation from corporate CEO to environmental advocate had been as dramatic as their own family's journey, but their relationship remained complicated by history and hurt. What did she want to discuss? She's been working with the EPA on long-term monitoring of the cleanup sites, and she thinks we could collaborate on a community health tracking system. The suggestion was professionally sensible, but emotionally complex. Rachel's environmental expertise and corporate experience could significantly enhance their community monitoring programs, but working with her required forgiveness that neither Darius nor Zoe had fully processed. "How do you feel about that?" Darius asked. Zoe was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the careful analysis she brought to all difficult decisions. "I think she's genuinely committed to environmental protection now. But I also think she feels guilty about what her company did, and sometimes guilt isn't the same as understanding." The insight was remarkably mature for a 16-year-old, but Zoe had been forced to develop sophisticated understanding of adult motivations and institutional dynamics far earlier than most people. "Do you want to meet with her?" "Maybe. But Dad, I want to make sure we're not being used to make her feel better about herself. Our work should be about protecting communities, not providing redemption opportunities for former corporate executives." Before Darius could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. "Congressional hearing on corporate environmental accountability next month. They want Zoe to testify about community-based monitoring. Interested?" The invitation was both an honor and a burden. Zoe's testimony could influence federal policy that would protect communities nationwide, but it would also extend her public role as a youth environmental advocate at an age when she should be focusing on college preparation and normal teenage experiences. "Another speaking opportunity?" Zoe asked, reading his expression. "Congressional testimony, environmental policy hearing." Zoe sighed with the weariness of someone who'd given hundreds of presentations about her water quality discoveries. "Dad, I want to help, but I'm tired of being the poster child for youth environmental activism. I want to be a normal teenager sometimes." The admission revealed the cost of their environmental justice work that neither of them discussed openly. Zoe's scientific discovery had made her a public figure, but celebrity activism was incompatible with adolescent development and academic focus. "You don't have to accept every invitation," Darius said. "We can choose opportunities that align with our goals without accepting every request for your time and expertise. But if I say no, and environmental legislation fails, will I be responsible for that?" The question illustrated how thoroughly Zoe had internalized responsibility for outcomes beyond her control. At 16, she felt personally accountable for environmental policy decisions made by adults who had far more resources and influence than any teenager should carry. "Zoe, you're not responsible for fixing every environmental problem or speaking at every event that might benefit from your presence. Your job is to grow up healthy and educated so you can contribute to environmental protection for decades, not just years." As they locked up the workshop space and prepared to return to Queens, Darius realized that their environmental victory had created new challenges that success hadn't prepared them to handle. Zoe's brilliance and moral courage had saved their community, but managing the consequences of that success required different skills than conducting water analysis or confronting corporate executives. The subway ride home gave them time to discuss Rachel's invitation and the congressional testimony request, weighing opportunities for impact against Zoe's need for normal adolescent experiences. "Dad," Zoe said as their train approached their stop, "what if we met with Rachel but not to work on EPA monitoring systems? What if we just talked to her as people who went through the same crisis from different perspectives?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I need to understand how someone can work for a company that's poisoning people without realizing what they're doing. And maybe she needs to understand how it feels to discover that your community is being harmed by people who have the power to stop it." The suggestion was characteristically thoughtful, Zoe seeking understanding rather than judgment, looking for human connection that might inform future environmental advocacy work. "That sounds wise," Darius agreed. "And regarding the congressional testimony?" Zoe was quiet for several blocks, watching Queens neighborhoods pass outside the train windows, communities that still showed environmental and economic scars from decades of industrial contamination and corporate neglect. I'll do the congressional testimony, Zoe decided, but only if they're serious about community-based monitoring legislation, not just interested in having a teenage witness for publicity purposes. As they walked from the subway to their apartment building, Darius reflected on how his daughter had learned to balance moral responsibility with practical limitations, understanding that sustainable environmental advocacy required protecting the advocates as well as the communities they served. Their small apartment felt like sanctuary after a day of teaching water quality analysis and planning community monitoring programs. Zoe settled at the kitchen table with college preparation materials, while Darius reviewed grant applications for expanding their environmental justice work. The evening routine was familiar, but far from the careful anonymity they'd maintained when Darius was a janitor trying to avoid attention. Now their work was public, their names were known in environmental circles, and their apartment served as an informal headquarters for community organizing activities. "Dad," Zoe said, looking up from her SAT practice materials, "do you ever miss when our biggest problem was just making rent and staying invisible?" Darius considered the question honestly. Their current life included financial uncertainty, public scrutiny, and constant pressure to address environmental problems that were larger than any individual family could solve. But it also included work that mattered, community relationships built on shared values, and the satisfaction of using their skills to protect vulnerable people. "Sometimes," Darius admitted. "But Zoe, I'm proud of who we've become, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. Even though it cost us our quiet life. Even though it cost us our quiet life. Because our quiet life was built on other people's suffering, and that's not sustainable for people with consciences." As Zoe returned to her college applications, writing essays about how environmental chemistry had shaped her understanding of community responsibility, Darius realized that their family's transformation was complete but ongoing. They were no longer the janitor and his daughter trying to stay invisible while powerful institutions poisoned their community. They were environmental advocates using scientific expertise and moral courage to protect communities that couldn't protect themselves. Some transformations, Darius understood, were irreversible, not because they couldn't be undone, but because they revealed truths about yourself that made returning to previous limitations impossible. Tomorrow, Zoe would continue training community members to monitor their own environmental health. Darius would continue working to ensure that environmental justice organizations had resources to challenge corporate contamination. And both of them would continue learning how to balance individual well-being with collective responsibility in ways that served both. The work was difficult, often frustrating, and occasionally dangerous. But as Darius looked at his daughter, brilliant, principled, and committed to using her talents to protect others, he understood that some purposes were worth the cost they required. Some families, he realized, were transformed by crisis into something stronger and more essential than what they'd been before. This story reminds us that environmental justice often requires ordinary families to make extraordinary sacrifices, and that protecting community health sometimes costs everything you thought you wanted from life. In a world where corporate power routinely overwhelms individual conscience, Zoe and Darius's journey shows us that scientific truth combined with moral courage can challenge even the most entrenched systems of harm. The path from discovery to justice is never simple or clean. Victory often comes with costs that test whether we're willing to pay the price our principles demand. Sometimes the most important lessons come not from winning, but from learning how to fight battles that matter, regardless of their personal cost. What truths are you avoiding, because addressing them would complicate your life? What communities depend on your courage to speak up about systems that harm them? Like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional harm, the importance of scientific literacy in environmental protection, and the truth that sustainable communities require citizens willing to prioritize collective well-being over personal convenience.